So I'm going to start this talk with my own personal experience of the Triratna System of Meditation. And then I'm going to look at some ways we can work with these practices ourselves. So before I begin, let me remind you of the 5 stages of the system I'll be mentioning as we go along. So there's integration, positive emotion, spiritual death or vision, spiritual rebirth or transformation, and then the stage of no more effort, or a spontaneous compassionate activity. So when I first came along to the Colchester Buddhist group in 1997, I was firstly introduced to the Metta-Bhavana meditation. I'd come across meditation whilst exploring Eastern traditions while I was living on a kibbutz in Israel. I'd read about the benefits of meditation and was fascinated to go deeper into my own mind. I found some basic instructions, I think from some Zazen manual, which instructed me to sit down facing the wall, sit upright and count my breath in cycles of 4. So this is what I did. Of course, I set up my room a bit like a cross between an Indian and a Zen style temple. So I lit some Nag Champa incense, put on some very chilled sitar music, and I sat down cross-legged on the floor and began to meditate. But just after a few breaths, my mind began to wander. And after a few more breaths, my body began to ache. And after a few more breaths, I began to writhe and wriggle, shaking and becoming infuriated with myself, and I gave up. How was I to reach perfect enlightenment when I couldn't even sit for 5 minutes? Where was this perfect Zazen that I'd read about? In my fantasies, I was a Buddha, but in reality, I was anything but. Even with that chilled Indian music, that strong smell of incense and the setup of a temple, I began to realize it was my own mind that was the problem. Maybe I had stacks of bad karma. Maybe my lifestyle wasn't that helpful. Smoking dope, drinking alcohol, and my pathetic attempt to become more flexible with yoga. Still, I continued to try. I truly wanted to become enlightened. And in my research, I'd found out that meditation was the way. So I did stick with it, counting each of my breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was working very slowly, but my mind was starting to calm. I was becoming more focused, becoming a little more integrated. I was a meditator, or so I thought. So I kept up this practice for some time before eventually returning to the UK, back to Colchester. So whilst visiting a mind, body, spirit exhibition, I wandered around, fascinated at the vast array of crystals, incense and astrology stuff, various New Age paraphernalia. And there, on one of the stalls, was a small sign saying Colchester Buddhist Group. As I walked past, a lady asked me, quite innocently, "Do you meditate?" Later I learned this was a Tilyamati to be, and this meeting would change my whole life. This was the first time I'd ever discussed my meditation with anybody, and there I was speaking to another meditator. I probably spoke far too much. My enthusiasm, as some of you know, can sometimes get carried away. But before eventually leaving the stall, I promised to attend the next meditation class. So the very next Wednesday at 7:30, I went along to the Life Force building in Oxford Road and met a rather strange bunch of people waiting in the lounge for the class to begin. Interesting, I thought. The carpet here is the same as the one I grew up in Croydon in the 1970s. A gory, bright psychedelic carpet, most unusual. And in fact, I've never seen one again. Thereafter, I tell the story, as many others do, of that feeling of coming home. For myself, it was like coming home literally to my old house in Sefton Road. After a very warm welcome and introduction to the evening from Harsha Prabha, we were shown into another room where cushions and mats were set up. There was a small Buddha, lit candles, some flowers in a vase, incense burning. This was finally it, my chance to become a Buddha. That evening, I was introduced to a completely different type of practice to what I'd ever done before, the Metta Bhavana. And gosh, this was even harder. It seemed to go on for absolutely ever. By the time it was over, I couldn't wait for that cup of tea that I'd been promised at the beginning of the evening. And of course, the biscuits. The rest of that evening, we explored the concept of self, non-self, being and non-being, which really threw me. I ended up in a bit of an argument with Amoghavajra about ego, self and non-self, and left angrily walking down Oxford Road. But the moon was out, the stars shining brightly, and as I walked down the road back home, I noticed with complete lucidity the majesty of the trees, the evening sky, and the feeling of excitement and exhilaration like I was seeing with new eyes. Perhaps the meditation had worked after all. I felt more connected, more in touch with myself and others, and for the next day or two at least, very emotionally positive. The following week, I returned to learn the mindfulness of breathing. Strangely, we didn't all face the wall, and I found there was more to simply counting, progressing the practice to no count, and even more deeply to focusing down on that point where the breath passes the entrance to the nostrils. Each week, we alternatively practiced the two meditations, and slowly there was some improvement. By the time I went on my very first weekend retreat at Rivendell Retreat Centre, my meditation practice had improved somewhat, although I did struggle with the longer sits. I did take my practice very seriously though, and often sat for long hours, really trying to get enlightened, although I wasn't really sure what that really meant. Here's Rivendell Retreat Centre, my first retreat. So after a couple of years attendance, I became what is known as a mitra or friend, and began to attend study groups at the new Colchester Buddhist Centre at Manor Road, going deeper in our exploration of both meditation and the Dharma. I learnt new meditations, including the 6 element practice, the letting go of each of the elements of earth, water, fire, air, space, and consciousness, and imagining of letting go of each of them after connecting and seeing each element both within and without. This powerful practice had a very strong effect on me. After each sit, I felt strangely altered, as if that which I considered to be myself was falling away. Some describe it as a spiritual death, a letting go of the sense of the old self, seeing the self as impermanent and insubstantial, even as a stage of vision, a vision of reality as it really is. As I pursued diligently my attendance at the centre, I was inspired to ask for ordination. As part of the ordination training, I learned new meditation practices including the visualization of the refuge tree, holding the visualization of the tree and its figures of Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Arahants, practitioners in my mind, as I prostrated many, many times in front of the huge shrine at Padmaloka. These practices completely blew me away. My world view was changing, I was seeing the world of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in my mind's eye, opening up something far more profound than I had previously realized. In 2006, ordination dawned, and I was named Amalaketu, pure comet, by my private preceptor, Artapriya. As part of the ordination, I was introduced to the counterbalance to spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, in the form of Vajrasattva, the Vajra being of purity, an embodiment of enlightenment, an envisioning of myself and the essence of awakening, Bodhi, as ultimately one. For me, this represented the culmination of all the other meditation practices I had been practicing until then, including all of the practices, mindfulness, of integration, metta bhavana, and its effect of positive emotion, the 6 element practice as an experience of spiritual death, and now this new visualization or sadhana, rebirth or renewal as myself as a spiritual being, a total transformation. For many years, I continued to practice hard, going to visit our retreat centers, Padmaloka and Vajraloka, to go deeper in my meditation practice. I continued my aspiration to reach full and perfect enlightenment, pushing hard, sitting on after meditations were finished, getting extra hours in if I could, even going on a very full-on Goenka Vipassana retreat for a week, each day starting at 4 a.m. and continuing until after 9:30 p.m. and not even food after midday. After some years, though, it felt I'd met a kind of plateau. I wasn't going any deeper, and my practice even took on a sense of dullness. I was doing it because I felt I should be doing it. I guess spilling into that second feta of rites and rituals, the idea that if we perform certain rituals, then we are living the spiritual life. My practice needed something else. So whilst on retreat at Vajraloka some years ago, I was introduced to formless meditation based on the Dzogchen and Mahamudra traditions. The basic observation that everything we experience arises in awareness. We are never outside awareness. As formless implies, there is no fixed form and no fixed object. We are simply aware of whatever happens to be. There is no deliberate attempt to develop or eradicate any quality. The effort that we exert, and actually this approach does require a lot of effort, at least to begin with, is devoted to continuously letting go into the moment. It seems paradoxical because we are nothing but awareness, yet we have to work to be aware. Eventually, it does become clear that awareness is effortless, but this effortless is usually only realized after a lot of hard work. This practice of letting things be or opening up to spaciousness was the realization, at least for me, of an opening to the possibility of the last stage of the system, the stage of spiritual receptivity, remaining open to that which is beyond that can be spoken. However, there is more to be said and explored in this stage. In Sangharakshita's Precious Garlands seminar, he describes the stage as compassionate activity. This means that having completely transformed oneself in accordance with one's original vision, one then is really able to help others. One could even say this is a stage of spontaneity, true spontaneity, where you sort of don't even think what you're going to do to help others, at least not in the ordinary way. You just spontaneously do it. You do what needs to be done. Since the lockdown, the Order have been meeting each week, online of course, to practice together the bodhicitta practice, bringing to mind all beings, and then breathing in their suffering, and breathing out love and compassion, transforming the suffering of the world by our breath. Although, of course, it's not our breath, nor in fact us doing it. We just have to be open to something other, as we ourselves would be completely blown away by the suffering of the world. So this is currently the culmination of my practice, and I hope it gives a flavour of Triratna's system of practice. So firstly, integration, cultivated through the mindfulness of breathing. Positive emotion through meditations like the Metta Bhavana. Spiritual death, connecting more and more deeply with the true nature of reality. And spiritual rebirth, connecting more deeply with the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And of course, no more effort or spontaneous compassionate activity for me, just sitting and bodhicitta practice. So now I'm going to say something more about this system in the context of our spiritual life. I've looked at the system in quite a personal way, in hierarchical stages to be developed one after the other in relation to meditation, but we can also find each stage implicit within the others. So if we're keen on a particular practice, such as the mindfulness of breathing, traditionally associated with integration, we can develop this further by being more in touch with the breath and our emotional responses, thus developing positive emotion, or seeing the rise and fall of the breath in terms of spiritual death and rebirth. And finally, seeing the connection between our breathing and all beings breathing, leading to spontaneously arising compassion. And we can also see the stages as a set of complementary and mutually supportive practices to be developed simultaneously, the development of one helping in the development of others. I suggest it's something like a flower that opens its petals. Each petal is connected to each other petal, and the flower can only fully unfold when all the petals unfold. When we can really see all 5 stages, we can see them in everything we're doing, whether in meditation, study or work, or in communication, or indeed anything at all. It can provide us a complete system for the spiritual life, so that everything we do is in harmony with our highest aspiration. So I'm just going to finish now with some examples of these. In integration, so we do practice mindfulness of breathing and perhaps mindfulness more generally, but are we mindful off the cushion? Do we remember where our keys are, where our glasses are? Do we remember to make that phone call? Or do we cover up perhaps our experience in some way, rather than be with whatever we're doing in the moment? Can we just eat or just listen to music? Positive emotion. There's that anecdote, isn't there, of the teacher who's interrupted while meditating on metta by his student, who then throws the meditation bell at him and shouts angrily, not to interrupt me while I'm meditating on love for all beings. But perhaps are we slightly guilty of this? Do we tend to communicate only with those we like the look of, rather than those we have a tendency to avoid? Also, how are our mental states on a day-to-day, hour by hour, even minute by minute basis? Are we positive to others in our mind? And are we sharing our positive states with others? And importantly, are we happier? Or can we actually ask ourselves and have a real look at that? Spiritual death. At its most profound level, spiritual death is insight, seeing reality, and the death of the old self. But how can we make this part of our day-to-day practice? I think it can be shown in a constant effort to let go of habits, views, and self-preferences. So are we willing to step out of our comfort zone? I think there can be a tendency to make spiritual life easy for ourselves, to fit in with our preferences. But I'm sure we've all been challenged in some way during the lockdown. Perhaps now is the time to reflect how we were. How was that? Maybe could we manage without our usual crutches? And spiritual rebirth. So how do we find an expression of enlightened beings into something more approachable, something that can be practiced on a day-to-day level off the cushions? Well, we can start looking from and starting from where we are. We could perhaps look to refine our being, Maybe spend more time looking at higher forms of art, spending time with those that are more refined, meeting up with those we consider further along the path from us, maybe more committed. And finally, true spontaneity or compassionate activity. So having completely transformed ourselves in accordance with our ideal, we're ready now to go out and help others. But can we just do that? Do what needs to be done without any self-reference, without thinking of ourselves? So firstly, we need to be positive and be able to think about the needs of others naturally and easily, bearing others in mind, not seeing them from a utilitarian perspective. Asking, how can I help this person? Can we develop a sensitivity to others? Listen more deeply to them. In some ways, there's very little we can do for others. As Bhante says in Wisdom Beyond Words, the whole sentimental idea of the Bodhisattva labelling out enlightenment to the humble masses is counterproductive as far as spiritual help goes, because it doesn't respect their individuality. And we have to be wary of developing our own ego. Yet we can try and we can do our best, whether being generous, giving time or energy, or simply just being kind. We can just do our best. So to conclude, the system of spiritual life is not just about meditation, but altruistic activity, giving, friendship, and so on. So we should be careful of identifying practice with just meditation. And we're practicing the spiritual life all the time. Perhaps from our dualistic minds, we're only practicing, we're on Zoom or on retreat or at the Buddhist center, and we're not when we go home and watch Netflix. But actually the spiritual life is everything we're doing. So in order to live a balanced spiritual life, we need to practice a system of meditation and see it in the context of a perfectly balanced spiritual life. Integrating our lives, radiating love, letting go, staying relaxed and receptive, and going out to others. We can then move from an inner transformation to an external one, changing ourselves and the world, and that is what the spiritual life is in all its fullness. Our commitment to practice needs to go beyond our sitting practice and out fully into the world. It's not just about me. It's not just about us, it's actually in all of us, in all that we do, whatever we're doing, all the time. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed that. If you're with our Zoom class, we're going to now explore some questions. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great day.